There is a particular kind of cold that does not announce itself. It does not rattle the windows or howl through the cracks in the siding. It simply arrives. It settles into the marrow of the earth the way a debt settles into a family, quietly, completely, without asking permission. The people of Harlan County, Montana, knew this cold the way they knew their own names. They had been born into it. They had buried their parents in it. And on the morning of September the 4th, 1888, when a 16-year-old girl named Clara Bowen stepped off the freight wagon at the edge of what passed for a town, she carried that cold with her like a second skin. She did not look like someone who was going to change anything. She was slight, in the way that children who have worked too hard from too young an age become slight, not frail, but worn down to the essential. Her hair was the color of creek mud after a hard rain, pulled back without ceremony. Her coat had been her father's, cut down and restitched at the shoulders, and it hung on her in a way that made her look like she was still growing into a life that had not yet fully arrived. She carried a canvas bag over one shoulder. Inside that bag was a woolen blanket, a cooking pot, a knife, a tin cup, 3 books she had read so many times the spines had given up entirely, and a small journal with a cracked leather cover that had once been dark brown and was now the color of old saddle leather left too long in the sun. That journal was the most important thing she owned. She did not know yet just how important. The town was called Denton Flats, which was an optimistic name for a place that was mostly mud, a general store with a sagging porch, a church that leaned slightly to the east as if trying to hear something the wind was saying, and a scattering of homesteads spread out across the high plateau like stones someone had dropped and not bothered to pick up. To the north, the Beartooth Range pushed its gray shoulders above the tree line. To the south, the plateau ran flat and brown and enormous until it simply ended at a place where the sky took over. It was the kind of landscape that made a person feel both free and forgotten at the same time. Clara had not come to Denton Flats because it was promising. She had come because it was the end of the line, and the end of the line was where the government was still handing out land to anyone willing to stake a claim and survive on it for 5 years. 160 acres. The Homestead Act of 1862. All a person needed was to be 21 years of age, a citizen of the United States, and the head of a household. Clara was 16 years old. She knew this before she came. She had spent 3 months working as a domestic in Billings, scrubbing floors and hauling laundry, and saving every dollar she earned. And in those 3 months, she had read the homestead statutes twice through, looking for the door that was not locked to her. She found one. A miner who was the sole surviving member of a household and who could demonstrate an ability to maintain and improve the land could petition the local land office for a modified claim under the guardianship provision of the Supplementary Homestead Act of 1875. It was a narrow door, but it was a door. She had $190 in her coat pocket, which was every dollar she had earned in those 3 months, minus the cost of the freight wagon north and 2 weeks of beans and bread. She had the journal. She had the coat that had been her father's. And she had walked through the door of the land office in Denton Flats at 8:30 in the morning, set her paperwork on the counter, and waited. The man behind the counter was a pale, soft-looking fellow named Grady, who wore his collar too tight and kept touching it with one finger, as if checking to make sure it had not escaped. He looked at Clara's paperwork. He looked at Clara. He looked back at the paperwork. He excused himself and went through a door at the back of the office, and Clara heard low voices, and then the door opened again, and a different man came out. Judge Raymond Holt was 61 years old and built the way certain mountains are built, Not dramatically, not aggressively, but with a settled, permanent quality that suggested he had always been there and intended to remain. He was clean-shaven and had grey eyes that did not blink more than was necessary. He wore a good wool suit, not the best suit Clara had ever seen, but a suit that had been pressed that morning by someone who knew how to press a suit. He carried himself with the particular ease of a man who had never in his adult life been required to justify himself to anyone. He looked at Clara's paperwork for a long time. Then he looked at Clara. She held his gaze without difficulty. She had learned long ago that looking away first was the beginning of losing. He said, in a voice that was neither unkind nor gentle, that the guardianship provision required a certified affidavit from a county magistrate in the claimant's county of origin, confirming the minor's status as sole surviving household member, notarized and filed no less than 60 days prior to the claim application. He set the paperwork back on the counter between them with a small, precise movement, the way a man returns a tool to its correct position on a workbench. Clara had known this was possible. She had read the statute closely enough to see the places where it had teeth. She said, without raising her voice, that she had a death certificate for her father, Henry Bowen, issued by the county coroner of Silver Bow County, dated March of 1887, and a sworn statement from the minister of the First Methodist Church of Butte, attesting to the fact that she was the sole surviving member of the Bowen household. She slid both documents across the counter. Holt looked at them. He was quiet for a moment, in the way that powerful men are quiet when they are deciding something they have already decided. He said that the sworn ministerial statement was not a magistrate's affidavit. He said that, without the proper documentation, the land office could not process the modified claim. He said that she was welcome to return to Silver Bow County, obtain the correct documentation from a county magistrate, and reapply in 60 days, at which point the office would review her petition on its merits. Clara was quiet for a moment. She looked at the documents on the counter between them. She asked if there was any other way. Holt said there was not. She nodded once. She picked up her documents. She folded them carefully and put them back in her coat pocket. She picked up her canvas bag from the floor where she had set it. She walked out of the land office and stood on the sagging porch and looked out at the high brown plateau and the grey mountains at its edge and the enormous pale sky above everything, and she did not cry because she had learned that crying was a thing you did in private, after the work was done, if there was time. She stood there for the long moment. The freight wagon that had brought her was gone. She had $190. She had no shelter. And in 6 weeks, the first hard frost would come off the Beartooth Range, and by December, the temperature on this plateau would drop to places that could kill a man in an hour. She picked up her bag and walked north, toward the creek she had seen from the wagon, where the land was rocky and scrubby, and nobody had claimed it yet because nobody wanted it. She found a place where a small cut bank overhung the creek bed, enough to keep the rain off if she slept close to the bank. She put down her bag. She opened the journal. The journal had belonged to her father, Henry Bowen, who had been a miner in the silver camps of Butte for 11 years before the mountain took him. He had been a careful man with few words and enormous hands, the kind of hands that could feel the quality of stone the way a musician feels pitch. He had written in the journal sporadically, not every day, sometimes weeks between entries, and his handwriting was the handwriting of a man who had taught himself to read as an adult, large and deliberate and without flourish. Clara had read every page many times, but there was one section she came back to more than any other, a series of entries from the winter of 1884, when her father had been caught in an early blizzard 3 days' ride from the nearest camp, with nothing but a pickaxe, a bedroll, and whatever he could carry. He had survived by doing something that most men would not have thought to do. He had dug down. The entry from that December read, in her father's careful hand, "The men who freeze out here do it standing up. They build their fires and their walls up, and they fight the wind. And the wind wins every time, because the wind is stronger, and it never gets tired." I have been in these mountains long enough to know something those men do not. The ground below 4 feet does not know what season it is. It does not feel the blizzard. It is the same temperature in January as it is in June, somewhere between 50 and 60 degrees, give or take. If you are cold, you do not fight upward. You go down. You go to where the cold has not reached. You take that warmth that the earth has been holding all summer, and you use it. A man in a proper dugout, with a small fire and a good door, can stay warm enough to survive on a fraction of the wood. A man in a cabin burns in a single night. The earth is a better heater than any iron stove. It is just slower, and it never runs out of fuel. Clara read this entry in the fading September light, sitting on her canvas bag with her back against the cutbank. A cricket was working somewhere in the dry grass behind her. The creek made its quiet noise over the stones. She read the entry twice. Then she picked up a stick and drew a rectangle in the dirt at her feet, roughly 10 feet wide and 16 feet long. She was not thinking about the land office. She was not thinking about Judge Raymond Holt. She was thinking about the entry her father had written 4 years before he died, and the thing he had understood about the earth, and whether she understood it too. She thought she did. She spent the night under the cutbank. In the morning, she ate the last of her bread, drank from the creek, and walked back into town. Denton Flats in the morning had a quality of reluctant activity, as if the town itself was not quite convinced it was worth getting up for. The general store was open. 3 horses stood at the rail outside it, with the defeated patience of horses who have been standing at rails for a long time. A dog of indeterminate breed and general pessimism lay in the middle of the street and did not move when Clara walked past it. She went to the general store and spent carefully. A good shovel, the second heaviest one they had, because the heaviest was too long for the angle she needed. 2 coils of rope, a box of nails, a draw knife, a hatchet, oilskin for waterproofing, a 20-pound sack of dried beans, cornmeal, salt pork. She spent $41 and carried what she could back to the creek in 2 trips, leaving the shovel and rope for the second. On her second trip back through town, Walt Greer was standing on the porch of his building. Walt Greer was a contractor and builder, the only one, for 60 miles in any direction. And he had the bearing of a man who understood this and was not modest about it. He was 45 years old, thick through the chest and shoulders, with a reddish-brown beard and the squinting eyes of someone who has spent a great deal of time looking at things that are not quite plumb. He had come to Montana from Ohio 8 years ago with a wagon load of tools and a well-thumbed copy of a builder's manual published in 1876, and in those 8 years he had built 11 structures in and around Denton Flats, which made him the nearest thing the territory had to an authority on construction. He watched Clara go by with her shovel and her rope and her canvas bag of supplies. He said to no one in particular that the girl was going to dig herself a ditch and call it a house. Clara did not stop walking. She did not turn around. She said, without particular heat, that she was going to do exactly that. Greer said something to the man next to him, another contractor's assistant named Pete, and Pete laughed. Clara was already past them and did not hear what he said. She did not need to. She had heard variations of it her entire life, the particular quality of dismissal that men of a certain kind reserve for women and girls who are doing things those men have decided are not appropriate, and she had long since stopped carrying the weight of it. Walt Greer was not a stupid man. That was the thing that mattered most about him, and the thing that made him most dangerous in the specific way that competent men who have never been seriously wrong can be dangerous. He had built 11 structures in this county. He had poured foundations in permafrost and raised roof beams in crosswinds and cut and fitted joists by hand in temperatures cold enough to split an axe handle. He knew wood, he knew load bearing and rafter span, and the particular way a Montana winter found the weak points in a structure, the way water finds the lowest path. He knew all of this, the way a man knows anything he has done successfully for 20 years, which is to say, he knew it completely and without question, and the absence of question is sometimes the most treacherous thing a man can carry into a new situation. He watched Clara walk away with her shovel, and he shook his head, and the head shaking was entirely genuine, which is to say, he was not performing contempt. He felt it. He believed it. That was the beginning of his problem, though he would not know it for months yet. She found her rectangle in the dirt where she had left it. She picked up the shovel, and she began. The first thing anyone discovers about digging in Montana high country is that the topsoil, which looks soft and yielding from above, is in fact held together by approximately 40 million years of grass roots, which have created a matrix of such density and stubbornness that a shovel striking it sounds less like digging and more like argument. Clara had expected this. She had read her father's journals closely enough to know that the first 18 inches would be the hardest, that the roots would resist, and the blade would skip, and her hands would blister, and the work would feel for a long time as if it was going nowhere. She dug anyway. She dug in a methodical pattern, working from the center outward, cutting and lifting and cutting again. The September sun was still warm enough in the middle of the day to raise a sweat, and she worked without stopping through the morning and into the afternoon, taking water from the creek and resting when her arms shook too badly to be useful. By the time the light went golden and flat and long across the plateau, she had gone down perhaps 14 inches across most of her rectangle and perhaps 20 in the center where the roots were slightly less dense. She was not discouraged. She had expected this. Her father had written, "Do not measure the first day by how deep you have gone. Measure it by whether you are still standing at the end of it. If you are ahead." She cooked beans over a small fire and ate them from her tin cup, and read by the firelight until the fire burned low. The sky above the plateau was enormous and black, and absolutely full of stars, the kind of sky that people who live in cities never see and would not know what to do with if they did. Clara looked up at it for a while before she slept. She was thinking about the depth of the earth below her, the miles and miles of it, all that thermal mass, all that stored summer heat, sitting quiet and patient and waiting. She slept well for the first time in a long time. 3 days into the digging, a visitor arrived. Reverend Amos Clay was a tall man with a long face and the kind of beard that suggested strong convictions about nature rather than negligence about grooming. He was 53 years old and had been the pastor of the Denton Flats Baptist congregation for 6 years, having come from Tennessee with his wife, his Bible, and an absolute certainty about the spiritual significance of most things. He was not a cruel man. This was important to understand. He was, in many ways, a genuinely good man, generous with what he had, patient with the weak and the grieving, tireless in his care for the sick. He was also a man who had organized his entire understanding of the world around a set of principles that he had worked out many years ago and had not significantly revised since. And he brought to those principles the same confidence that a man brings to a map he has used many times without getting lost. He stood at the edge of Clara's excavation and looked down at her. She was 4 feet down by this point, and her head was just below the surface of the ground. She was cutting at the sidewall with her draw knife, smoothing the clay, which had become, at this depth, exactly what her father had described: damp, dense, cooperative. Clay said that he had come to check on her welfare. He said it in the voice of a man who is performing an act of charity and is not entirely unconscious of doing so. Clara said, without stopping her work, that she appreciated that. He looked at the hole for a while. He said that he had to be honest with her, the way a Christian man was obligated to be honest with those under his pastoral care, and what he had to say was that he was not sure this was the right approach. He said that the Lord had provided timber and stone and the knowledge of how to use them, and that there were families in the congregation who might be willing to help her build a proper structure if she would only ask. He said that what she was doing looked less like building and more like burying, and he was not sure he was comfortable with the metaphor. Clara set down her draw knife. She looked up at him from the bottom of her excavation, 4 feet of Montana clay between her and the surface of the world. She said, without unkindness, that she had read about earth shelters in her father's journals and that the physics of them were sound. She said the thermal mass of the earth at this depth would maintain a temperature between 55 and 65 degrees regardless of the surface temperature, and that with a small fire and a proper door, she could keep the interior at a livable temperature through even the worst Montana winter on a fraction of the fuel a wood frame house required. Clay was quiet for a moment. He said that he respected her father's memory, and he did not doubt the man's practical knowledge, but that there was a reason people built upward, that there was something spiritually significant about reaching toward the sky, about aspiring to height, about not returning to the earth before your time. Clara picked up her draw knife and went back to smoothing the wall. She said quietly that the sky would still be there when she came up. Clay walked away, with the particular gait of a man who has not won an argument, but has not quite lost one either, which he considered a reasonable outcome under the circumstances. On the 7th day, Judge Holt rode by. He did not stop. He was on his way to inspect his southern pasture, or so Clara assumed, because he came from the direction of a town and went in the direction of the creek crossing that led to the Holt land grant, which was the largest single private holding in the county, something close to 3,000 acres that Holt had been accumulating since 1871. He was riding a good gray horse at an easy walk, and as he came abreast of Clara's work site, he slowed without stopping and looked at what she was doing with those gray, unblinking eyes. She was 7 feet down by this point. The excavation was nearly complete. The full 10 by 16 footprint at its proper depth, the walls smoothed and packed. She was laying the river gravel floor, stone by stone, selecting pieces of a specific size and density that she had been gathering from the creek bed over 3 days of careful sorting, carrying them up in her canvas bag, 3 or 4 at a time. Holt looked at the excavation. He looked at Clara. His face was entirely still, which could have meant nothing or could have meant a great deal. He said, in the tone of a man stating a fact, rather than making a judgment, that she was still on unclaimed land. Clara said yes. He said that the land office had no record of an approved homestead claim for this parcel. Clara said that was correct, that her application had been denied pending proper documentation, and that she was working on obtaining that documentation. Holt looked at the river gravel she was laying. He looked at it for longer than seemed necessary. Then he looked back at Clara. He said that she should be aware that improvements made to unclaimed land could complicate any future ownership dispute, and that the county had an interest in maintaining clear title to undeveloped parcels. Clara looked up at him on his grey horse against the pale September sky. She said evenly that she understood that, and that she hoped to have her documentation in order before the matter required any further attention. Holt said nothing for a moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat with one finger, a small formal gesture that meant nothing and possibly everything, and rode on. Clara watched him go. She held the stone she had been about to place for a moment, feeling its weight and its particular smoothness, the way the creek had worked it over years into something perfectly suited to hold and release heat. She placed it with care, pressing it level into the dirt beneath it, the way her father had described in the journal entry she had memorized long before she understood why she was memorizing it. Then she went back to work. The roof was the hardest part. She spent 3 days along the creek, finding fallen cottonwoods, dragging them by rope to the excavation, cutting them to length with the hatchet. The work was the kind of physical labor that reveals something about a person, not their strength, because strength is a simple thing and can be measured, but their relationship with difficulty, whether they treat it as an obstacle or a material. Clara treated difficulty as a material. She used it the way she used everything else, as something to be understood and worked with, rather than fought. The rafters she cut to 8-foot lengths, 8 of them laid across the width of the excavation at 18-inch intervals. She notched them into the packed clay of the side walls, testing each one for load-bearing before she committed to it, standing underneath and pressing upward with both hands, feeling for the give or the solidity. When she found what she needed, she moved to the next. The sod came after. She cut blocks from the undisturbed prairie 20 yards from the excavation, each block 12 inches by 24, 3 inches thick, held together by the root matrix that had resisted her shovel for the first day of digging. Each block weighed more than it had any right to. She carried them on a board she dragged with the rope, 3 at a time, laid them across the rafters in overlapping rows, 3 layers deep, 12 inches of living prairie earth over her head. It took 4 days. By the end of it, her hands had stopped hurting, which meant the nerve endings had given up complaining, which she understood was not the same thing as being all right, but would do for now. The front wall she built from cottonwood uprights, 4-inch diameter, driven into the ground side by side. She packed the gaps with dried grass and sealed them with clay mortar. She mixed herself from creek-bottom clay and water and more dried grass, working it with her hands until it had the consistency of stiff bread dough, then pressing it into every gap and crack and pinhole with her fingers. When the sun dried it, it went hard as the stone she had laid on the floor. She found the door in pieces. An abandoned freight wagon 3 miles west along the creek had left behind 2 good planks and a set of iron hinges that still worked. She built the frame herself from cottonwood, cut the planks to fit, and hung it slightly crooked but tight, which was all that mattered. The hearth she built in the east corner from the same rounded creek stones she had used for the floor, smaller ones this time, fist-sized, polished smooth. She stacked them in a U-shape 18 inches across, built them up to 2 feet, left an opening at the front for loading wood and air. For the flue she used 4 kerosene tins from the trash heap behind the general store, cut open and flattened and shaped into a rough cylinder, linked together and sealed with wet clay. It went straight up through a hole she had cut in the sod roof, sealed around the penetration with more clay. It was not beautiful. It worked. From start to finish, The entire structure had cost her $71 in materials, which left her $119 and the beginning of winter. She stood inside her completed dugout on the first evening of October and looked at what she had made. The space was small, 10 by 16 feet, low enough that she had to bend slightly near the walls where the sod roof met the earthen walls. The light came from a single candle she had bought at the general store. In that light, the packed clay walls had a warm amber quality, and the riverstone floor caught and held the candlelight in the way that polished surfaces do, as if the stones were thinking about light and deciding how much to give back. She thought about her father. She thought about the journal, which she had been reading a little at a time since she arrived, rationing it the way she rationed her beans, because she knew there was a limit to it. She thought about the entries she had read and the ones she had not yet read, and the way certain words had stayed with her longer than others. She had read, early in the journal, a passage she had initially not understood, and had then, slowly, over weeks, come to understand more deeply than anything else he had written. He had written it in the winter of 1882, 6 years before he died, 6 years before the mountain took him. It was not long. He wrote, "I have been thinking about the difference between a man who fights the cold and a man who understands it. The fighter burns more wood. He stays up later. He patches the same gaps the wind keeps finding. He is always one step behind. The man who understands the cold knows where it cannot go. He builds his house there. He does not fight. He positions himself. There is a kind of wisdom in that I did not have when I was young, and I am not sure I have fully yet. Clara, if you ever read this, learn from my mistakes more than my methods. The methods I figured out. The wisdom took longer." She sat cross-legged on the riverstone floor and read that passage in the candlelight. Her father had addressed it to her. He had known she would read it. He had been writing to her from the beginning, not for himself, not to record his days, but to leave something behind for the daughter he had known would need it. She thought about the last time she had seen him. She had been 14. He had come home from the mine on a Friday evening in early spring with creek mud on his boots and his hands wrapped in cloth because the rockwork had opened them again, the way it always did in cold weather. He had sat down at the table, and she had brought him bread, and he had eaten it without speaking, not from coldness, but from the exhaustion that the mines put in a man, the kind that goes into the muscle and the bone and requires silence to work itself out. She had sat across from him, and they had not spoken for perhaps 20 minutes, and at the end of those 20 minutes he had looked up at her and said with absolute directness that she was the best thing he had ever done, and that he was sorry he had not done more things as well. She had not known what to say to that at 14. She knew now what it was. It was a man trying to give what he had while he still had time to give it. She closed the journal and held it in both hands for a moment. Outside the thick sod walls and the 7 feet of Montana earth, the wind was picking up out of the north, carrying the first real cold of the season down off the Beartooth Range. She could hear it, faintly, the way you hear weather at sea, as a note rather than a noise, distant and significant. Inside, the air was still. The temperature, without any fire, without any heat source beyond the earth itself, and the warmth of her own body, was somewhere she estimated between 58 and 62 degrees. She was wearing her father's coat, and she was not cold. She struck a match and touched it to the small bundle of dry grass and twig she had laid in the hearth. The fire caught immediately, a modest thing, nothing dramatic, more light than heat at first. She watched it grow into the kindling she had laid over it, felt the first real warmth begin to move through the small space, felt the river stones at her back, and beneath her, begin slowly to absorb it. She was not happy. She was not unhappy. She was something more fundamental than either, which was present, located, positioned. For the first time, since her father had died in the dark of a collapsed mine shaft 18 months ago, she was somewhere. She had made somewhere out of nothing, and the will to go down rather than up, and the words of a man who had understood the earth well enough to write them down. She did not know yet about the letter. She did not know about the document her father had filed with the county 6 years before he died, the careful technical description of a heating system that Judge Raymond Holt had read and filed away and never shared, because he had known even then what it would mean for the people who bought lumber from the mill in which he had quietly held a 40% interest since 1880. She did not know any of that yet. She knew only the warmth of the stones and the sound of the wind and the weight of her father's journal in her hands. She lay down on her bedroll, pulled her blanket up, and closed her eyes. The fire burned low. The stones held the heat. The earth held everything. Outside, the first snow of the season came down off the Beartooth in fine, dry needles, and the plateau went white from horizon to horizon under a black and starless sky. The wind drove it sideways past the faint outline of a low mound in the earth near Willow Creek that was barely distinguishable from the rest of the frozen ground. No smoke, no light, no sign of life, which is not the same thing as no life at all. Sometime in the middle of that night, Clara woke briefly. The fire was out. The air inside the dugout was warm and still. She put her hand flat on the river stones beside her bedroll and felt the heat still radiating from them, slow and steady, the way a body gives off heat in sleep. She had not shivered once. Her lungs did not ache. The cold outside was absolute, and she was inside it, and she was warm. She went back to sleep. 3 weeks later, Judge Raymond Holt sat at the desk in his office and signed a notice of intent to review the legal status of improvements made to the unclaimed parcel along Willow Creek, parcel number 47 of the Harlan County Land Register. It was a routine document. It was also, if it went where he intended it to go, the beginning of a legal mechanism that could strip Clara Bowen of everything she had built and leave her with nothing before the true winter arrived. He signed it with the same neat, precise signature he used for everything. He blotted it. He set it in the outgoing tray on the corner of his desk. Then he went home to his large, well-built, 2-story frame house with its glass windows and its Chicago iron stove and its genuine plank floors, and he sat in his good chair by his good fire, and he read the newspaper, and he was warm. For now, he was warm. Outside, on the plateau, the real cold had not yet come. It was gathering itself up in the north, in the high passes of the Beartooth Range, in the long darkness above the tree line where the weather is made. It was patient, the way cold is always patient. It did not need to hurry. It had all winter, and so did Clara Bowen. The notice of intent arrived at the general store on a Tuesday morning in late October, folded inside an official county envelope with Judge Raymond Holt's name, embossed in the upper left corner. The store owner, a heavy-set man named Dunbar, who kept his opinions to himself except when he did not, held it up and turned it over once in his thick fingers before sending his boy out with it toward Willow Creek. The boy came back 20 minutes later and said the girl was not there, meaning she was not visible above ground, which was not the same thing. He had left the envelope wedged in the frame of a small wooden door, set flush into a low mound of earth that he had nearly walked past twice before he realized what it was. Clara read the notice that evening by candlelight. She read it carefully, the way she read everything her father had written in his journal, which is to say she read for what was underneath the words as much as for the words themselves. The legal language was precise and, in its precision, deliberately obscure, but its meaning was not complicated. Judge Holt intended to argue that improvements made to unclaimed land by a party without a valid homestead claim constituted unauthorized use of public territory, and that the county had both the authority and the obligation to review the situation and determine appropriate remediation. Remediation was a word that could mean many things. In this context, it meant one thing, which was removal. She folded the notice back into the envelope. She sat for a while with it in her hands, feeling the warmth of the river stones through the soles of her boots, listening to the small sound the earth makes when it is doing its work, which is not quite silence and not quite sound, but something between the two. The deep, slow respiration of ground that has been accumulating heat since June and has no intention of letting it go before April. She was not panicking. She had no capacity for panic in the useless sense, the kind that moves in circles and burns energy without producing anything. She had, instead, the thing her father had taught her by example over 14 years of watching him work in conditions that would have broken other men, which was the ability to look at a problem from the outside, to see its shape and its weight and its particular weaknesses, and to begin. The next morning, she walked into Denton Flats and went to the land office. Grady was behind the counter. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, with the expression of a man who has been handed a situation he did not create and does not entirely know how to resolve. She placed the notice of intent on the counter. She said calmly that she would like to know the precise legal procedure for contesting a notice of this kind. She said she was not asking for advice. She was asking for the statute number. Grady looked at the notice. He looked at Clara. He went through the door at the back, and she heard low voices, and then he came back out and said that the contesting procedure was outlined in the Montana Territorial Code, Chapter 14, Section 7, available for public review at the county courthouse in Billings. Billings was 90 miles away. Clara said that she understood. She picked up the notice. She thanked him and left. She spent that afternoon writing a letter to the courthouse in Billings, requesting a copy of the relevant statute sections by mail. She spent the following morning splitting kindling and stacking it inside the dugout in the space she had designated for fuel storage, against the north wall where the earth stayed coolest and the wood would not dry out too fast. She had been collecting dead timber from along the creek since the roof went on, working in the late afternoons when the light was still good, dragging pieces up the bank and cutting them to length and stacking them with the careful deliberateness of someone who understands that the distance between enough and not enough is always smaller than it looks. She was not worried about warmth. The dugout had been performing exactly as her father's journal described. Through the first 2 weeks of November, when the surface temperature dropped below freezing overnight and the creek began to form thin ice at its edges in the mornings, the interior of the dugout maintained itself at a temperature she estimated at 60 degrees without any fire at all. With a small morning fire of the thinnest kindling, perhaps 10 minutes of burning, the stones would absorb enough heat to hold the interior above 65 through the rest of the day. A second small fire at dusk would carry her through the night. She was burning less wood in a week than she suspected Walt Greer burned in a single cold afternoon. It was on one of those afternoons, a grey Thursday in the second week of November, that Daniel Greer first appeared. He was 19 years old and looked younger, the way boys who have grown up fast sometimes do, as if the growth happened before the face was ready for it. He was tall, like his father, but carried himself differently, without the settled certainty that Walt Greer wore like a second coat. He came along the creek path from the direction of town and stopped at the edge of Clara's clearing, which was not much of a clearing, just a low earthen mound with a chimney pipe and a wooden door, and the general impression that the ground itself had decided to do something unusual. He stood at the edge of it and looked at it for a while. Clara came up through the door and straightened and looked at him. He said he was Daniel Greer. He said his father had sent him to check on the water level in the creek, which was something the Greer family monitored because their eastern pasture drained toward it. It was true enough to be worth saying, and not entirely the real reason he was there, and both of them understood this without either of them saying so. Clara said the creek level was about the same as it had been. She said it was down some from the fall rains, but nothing significant. He looked at the mound. He said, without the tone his father would have used, just as a plain question, that he had never seen anything built this way. Clara said most people hadn't. He said, still as a plain question, whether it actually worked. She thought about that for a moment. Then she said he was welcome to come inside and judge for himself. He ducked through the low frame of the door and stood in the interior, and was quiet for a long time. The candle was not lit. The only light came through the door frame behind him, pale and thin, and carrying none of the warmth that the enclosed air held. He had come from outside, where the temperature was in the mid-30s, and he stood now in an enclosed space that felt, as he would describe it later, like the inside of a barn at midday in September, which is to say warm without any apparent reason to be warm. He said quietly that it was something. Clara said her father had figured it out. He looked at the river stone floor. He looked at the packed clay walls with their amber tint. He looked at the small hearth in the corner with its carefully fitted stones and its kerosene tin flue. He was the kind of young man who looks at things the way a craftsman does, not for their appearance, but for their logic, trying to understand how each part relates to the others. And Clara could see him doing this, working through the construction the way you work through a sentence in an unfamiliar language, finding the grammar in it. He said that his father thought she was burning something other than wood. Buffalo chips, maybe, or coal. Clara said she was burning kindling. She picked up a handful of the thin, dried twigs she kept near the door and held them out. He looked at them. He said his father's house burned through a cord of wood in a bad week. Clara said she expected to use less than 2 cords through the whole winter. He was quiet again. She could see him doing the arithmetic, which was the kind of arithmetic that a son of a builder would naturally do. The comparison of fuel costs against structural performance. And she could see the moment when the result of that arithmetic landed, because his expression changed slightly, not dramatically, but in the way a face changes when it absorbs something that reorganizes other things it already knew. He stayed perhaps 40 minutes. He did not help with anything, and she did not ask him to. But before he left, he stopped at the door and turned back and said, in the tone of a man saying something he has been thinking about for longer than the conversation has been going on, that the floor was the part he did not understand. He said he would have put down boards. Clara said that boards trapped cold air underneath them. She said the river stones had been in the creek for long enough that they were denser than the surrounding earth, which meant they absorbed heat faster and released it slower. She said the floor was the battery and the fire was just the charge. He nodded once, slowly, in the way that men nod when they are not agreeing but committing something to memory. Then he went out through the door and back toward town along the creek path, and Clara watched him go and then went back inside and did not think much about it until 3 days later when she found the footprints. They came from the direction of town, the same path Daniel had used, and they circled the exterior of the mound in a careful wide arc, pausing at two specific points where the ground was softest and held an impression most clearly. At the first point, someone had knelt. The knee print was deep and precise. At the second point, near the base of the front wall, where the clay mortar met the ground, the soil had been disturbed in a way that suggested someone had been measuring, drawing a line or a mark, checking a dimension against something. Clara crouched at the knee print for a long time. She thought about Daniel Greer and the way he had looked at the floor. She thought about his father, who had 20 years of construction experience and the particular ambition of a competent man who has built his reputation on being the best at what he does in a place where being the best at what you do is not required to be excellent, only required to be better than the available alternatives. She thought about what Walt Greer would do with the information that a 16-year-old girl with no formal training had built something that outperformed every wood frame structure in the county by a factor he could not explain with his existing knowledge. She stood up. She went inside. She opened the journal to a specific page she had read before and read it again. Her father had written in the entry from December 1884, "The danger in showing a man something he does not understand is not that he will reject it. The danger is that he will try to copy it without understanding why it works. A man who copies the form without the principle is building a trap for himself and calling it progress." She read that twice. Then she closed the journal and went to the hearth and built a small fire and sat beside it and thought for a long time. In the morning, she went back to the exterior of the mound and made a small change to the front wall. She added a layer of clay mortar to the lower section, smoothed it carefully, embedded a specific arrangement of small stones in the fresh clay near the base. It looked like nothing. It looked like repair work, like maintenance, like the kind of thing a person does to a mud wall in the fall to prepare it for winter. But the arrangement of those stones and the angle at which she embedded them, and the particular depth of the mortar layer she applied over them, changed a structural relationship in the lower wall that was not visible from the outside and would not be apparent to anyone who had not read the relevant entries in Henry Bowen's journal. Anyone who copied the wall without that detail would have a wall that looked right. It would perform adequately in moderate cold. In severe cold, in the kind of cold that was still gathering itself above the Beartooth Range, it would fail. Not catastrophically, not immediately, but in the specific way that structures fail when they have been built to look correct rather than to be correct, quietly, incrementally, in the places where the theory was missing. She was not trying to hurt anyone. She was trying to protect what her father had understood, and she was doing it the only way available to her, which was to make the difference between the copy and the original invisible until the moment it mattered. November deepened. The plateau moved through its colors, the brown going gray and the gray going white at the edges. Frost first and then snow, thin at first and then accumulating, settling into the low places and drifting against anything that stood upright. The cattle in the Holt pastures wore ice on their backs in the mornings. The horses in the Greer yard stood in a tight knot facing south, their breath making a small communal cloud that hung in the still air of the early morning, and then dispersed as the wind picked up. Walt Greer had indeed built a second structure. Clara had seen it going up over 3 days in late October, visible from the slight rise near the creek where she gathered her kindling. It was not large, perhaps 8 by 10 feet, set into a slope at the north edge of the Greer property where the ground fell away slightly. He had called it a root cellar when his neighbor Fitch asked about it. He told Fitch he was putting up a place to store winter provisions, which was true as far as it went. But he had given it a door instead of a hatch, and he had installed the kerosene tin flue arrangement that was not necessary for a root cellar, and he had laid a wood plank floor over a frame of rough-cut lumber, which was the detail that would cost him most. Clara watched it go up without saying anything to anyone. She noted the plank floor. She noted the door, which was better hung than hers, and sealed tighter at the frame. She noted the single layer of sod on the roof, which was half the thickness of her own. She noted the way Greer packed the side walls with clay, and then, apparently dissatisfied with the finish, smoothed over them with a mix that had too much sand in it and not enough grass fiber, which would cause it to crack when the temperature dropped below 15 degrees. One layer of sod, sandy mortar, plank floor. She went back to her dugout and opened the journal and read her father's entry on the relationship between floor material and thermal retention for perhaps the fourth time since she had built her own floor. And she held the information the way you hold something fragile, carefully and with attention to where the weight was. The letter from Billings arrived in the second week of November. The relevant statute was 4 pages long and written in the language that statutes are written in, which is designed to be precise and achieves that precision by being nearly unreadable to anyone who is not already familiar with the vocabulary. Clara read it 4 times over 2 evenings. She made notes in the margin of a piece of brown paper she had saved from a supply package. By the end of the second evening, she had identified 2 things. The first was that Holt's legal argument had a genuine foundation. The county did have authority to review unauthorized improvements to unclaimed land, and the review process, once initiated, could result in a removal order. The second was that the review process required a public hearing, at which the party under review had the right to present evidence of continuous improvement and good faith effort toward legal claim establishment. And the statute included a provision she had not known about before, one that the Billings courthouse clerk had marked with a small penciled asterisk, as if he had thought it worth noting for the reader's attention. A minor claimant who could demonstrate active, substantial, and continuous improvement of an unclaimed parcel and who had filed a petition in good faith could not be removed during the winter months, defined as November 1st through March 31st, without a unanimous vote of the county commissioners, on the grounds that removal during winter conditions could constitute a threat to life. She read that provision 3 times. She set down the paper. She looked at the river stone floor and the clay walls and the sod roof above her head. She was not going anywhere. She wrote a letter that night to the county commissioners in Billings, brief and precise, citing the statute, noting the date of her good faith petition, listing the specific improvements she had made to the parcel, and invoking the winter removal protection provision. She sent it with Dunbar's supply wagon the following morning, which made the Billings run every 2 weeks. She told no one else about it. December came to the plateau the way a serious man arrives at a meeting, without announcement and without apology. The first week brought temperatures that dropped to 12 below zero at night and struggled to reach 15 above during the daylight hours. The creek froze solid enough to walk on in the first 3 days. The cattle that were not in barn stalls began to suffer. One of Holt's horses went lame from the cold and had to be brought inside. Clara's dugout held through those first December nights when the surface temperature fell to places that made the air itself feel brittle. The interior of the dugout maintained 63 degrees without any fire at all. With her morning and evening fires, each no more than 20 minutes of burning, it held above 68. She slept without extra clothing. She cooked her beans without her coat on. She read her 3 books for the 3rd time through and began rereading her father's journal from the beginning, which she had not done since she first arrived, and found things in it she had not understood in September that she understood now. because some things can only be understood from inside the experience they describe. She found, in the entry from January of 1885, a passage that stopped her. Her father had written, "I have been thinking about whether I should try to get this written down properly, the principles of the Earth shelter system, and filed somewhere official where it might be of use to others. I have worked out enough of the mathematics now that I believe I could explain it in terms that would hold up to scrutiny. The thermal mass calculation, the optimal depth relative to local soil composition, the floor material selection, the flue ratio for smoke evacuation versus heat retention. I think about the settlers on the plateau, the ones trying to get through winter on cordwood and luck, and I think there are people dying who do not have to die. I am going to write it up and file it with the county. If it helps someone, that is enough." Clara sat with that passage for a long time. Her father had tried. He had written it up. He had filed it. And somewhere between that filing and this moment, the document had gone into the same silence that swallows things that are inconvenient for people with the power to decide what is and is not convenient. She did not know this yet, with certainty. She only suspected it, the way you suspect a thing when the facts that should be visible are not there, and you can see the shape of what is missing. She closed the journal and lay on her bedroll and looked at the sod ceiling and thought about her father sitting at a table in a company boarding house in Butte, writing by lamplight, working out the mathematics of heat and earth and time, thinking about people dying who did not have to die. She thought about the particular kind of loneliness in that, the loneliness of understanding something that could help people and not being able to make them listen. She thought she understood that loneliness very well. The week before Christmas, Walt Greer came to find her. He came in the mid-afternoon, when the temperature was at its daily high of perhaps 8 degrees above zero, wearing his heavy coat and his work boots, and the expression of a man who has decided to do something difficult and has talked himself into it through the sheer force of professional pride. He stood outside her door and called her name. She came out and stood in the thin white light of the December afternoon and looked at him. He said, without preamble, that he had built a structure using similar principles to hers, and he was experiencing some difficulty with the performance. He said the interior temperature was lower than he had expected, given the depth of the excavation and the fuel he was using. He said he wanted to know if she had any thoughts on what the problem might be. He did not say he was sorry for laughing at her in October. He did not say he had been wrong. He did not say any of the things that a man in his position, asking a favor of someone he had publicly dismissed, might be expected to say. He asked his question the way a professional asks a professional, stripped of everything except the problem. Clara looked at him for a moment. She thought about the knee print in the frozen ground. She thought about the plank floor and the thin sod roof and the sandy mortar. She thought about her father's entry on copying without understanding. She asked him what he had used for his floor. He said milled lumber, 1-inch planks over a frame. She said that was the problem. He was quiet. She could see him fighting the instinct to argue, the 20-year professional instinct that said a wood floor was the correct approach, that it had always been the correct approach, that anyone who said otherwise was either wrong or did not know what they were talking about. She could see him fighting it and winning, which was something she had not expected and respected more than she had expected too. He asked her why. She said that wood insulated. She said in a wood frame house that was a benefit. It kept the cold from coming up through the floor. But in an earth shelter, the floor was not a barrier. It was a conductor. She said the ground at 6 feet held 58 degrees year-round. She said that temperature had to travel upward through the floor material into the living space. Stone conducted that transfer efficiently. Wood blocked it. He had put a barrier between himself and the only heat source that did not require fuel. He looked at her for a long time. She could see him taking it apart and putting it back together, the way a craftsman disassembles a mechanism to understand how it failed. She could see the moment when he had it, because his jaw tightened slightly, which in men who do not show much with their faces is the equivalent of a substantial reaction. He said quietly that he had built it wrong. Clara said yes. He asked if it could be fixed without tearing out the floor. She said not effectively. She said he could add stones over the wood, but the wood would still block the thermal transfer, and the added weight would stress the frame beneath it. She said the right fix was to remove the planks, dig another 6 inches down to undisturbed soil, and lay river stones directly on that surface. He nodded. He did not thank her. He turned and started back toward town along the creek path, and then he stopped without turning around and said over his shoulder that his son had told him the floor was the part he did not understand. Clara said nothing. He walked away. She watched him go and felt something she could not immediately name, which turned out, when she found the right word for it, to be pity. Not condescension, not satisfaction. Genuine pity, the kind that comes from understanding what it costs a man of Walt Greer's particular kind of pride to walk a quarter-mile in 12-degree weather to ask a question he should not have needed to ask. He had built 11 structures in this county. He had a reputation that was real and earned, and based on actual skill. And now he was standing in front of a 16-year-old girl asking her why his floor was wrong. And the only thing more difficult than that moment was the fact that he had done it anyway, which meant that whatever else he was not a coward about the things that mattered. She went back inside and sat on her riverstone floor and felt the slow, steady warmth of it through the fabric of her trousers and thought about Daniel Greer saying he would have put down boards and the particular expression on his face when she had told him why the stones were better, and the fact that he had told his father about it, and the fact that his father had come to ask her. She thought about the knee print in the frozen ground, and the measurement marks in the soil, and the way a man can be both genuinely skilled and genuinely wrong at the same time, and how the distance between those two things is sometimes only a single decision made in the wrong direction. One plank floor instead of one stone floor, one moment of trusting the familiar over the correct, and everything downstream from that moment bending toward failure. She thought about her father and the foreman who had not listened. She thought about what it means when the people with authority are also the people with the least incentive to update what they know. She was not certain whether that was progress or the beginning of something else. On the 22nd day of December, 1888, Clara opened the journal to the last pages her father had written, the ones she had been saving the way you save something you know cannot be replaced. She had read most of the journal twice through by now, but she had held these last pages back, not from fear exactly, but from a kind of respect for the finality of last things. The final entry was dated February of 1887, 3 weeks before the shaft collapsed. He had known, she understood now, that the shaft was weakening. He had told the mine foreman twice and been ignored both times. The entry was not about the mine. It was about her. He wrote, "I have been trying to work out what I can leave that will be of actual use. Not sentiment. Sentiment is for people who have time. I want to leave something that works, something that will still be working when I am not. The Earth shelter system is the best thing I have figured out in my life. It is not a small thing. I believe it could keep a family warm through a Montana winter on less fuel than most people burn in a week. I filed the technical description with the county 2 years ago. I have not heard back. I am going to write it up again and send it to the territorial office in Helena as well. Clara, if you are reading this, the principles are all in this journal. Start at the December 1884 entry and work forward. Trust the stones. Trust the depth. Do not let anyone tell you that going down is giving up. The earth holds its warmth the same way a good man holds his principles, quietly, without drama, through whatever the surface sends down. I love you. Build something that lasts. She read it twice. Then she closed the journal and held it against her chest and sat very still in the warmth of her dugout, while outside the temperature fell through 0 on its way to somewhere much colder, and the sky above the Beartooth Range turned the particular dark purple that people in Montana learn to recognize, the color of weather that has made up its mind. She did not cry. Not yet. She sat with it. She sat with it until she heard the wind change. Then she stood up and went to her door and opened it a crack and looked north toward the mountains. The sky was wrong. Not wrong in the way that ordinary bad weather makes a sky look wrong, but wrong in a deeper way. The way a face looks wrong when something has shifted behind the eyes. The cloud mass coming off the Beartooth was the color of old iron, and it was moving at a speed that was not consistent with the light wind at ground level, which meant the wind aloft was already something else entirely, something organized and purposeful and very large. She had seen weather reports in the general store. She had heard the old-timers talk all fall about the winter that was coming. The signs they read in the thickness of animal coats and the behavior of birds and the particular quality of the October cold, which had a depth to it that the veterans of 20 Montana winters said they had not felt before in a season that early. She pulled the door closed. She checked the door seal, pressing her palm along the frame at every point, feeling for air movement. She checked the flue damper she had fashioned from a piece of tin that could be dropped into the pipe to seal it from below when the fire was out. She checked her water supply, 2 full kettles, and the covered bucket near the north wall. She checked her fuel, the stacked kindling along the north wall, the larger pieces of split cottonwood in the back corner. She had enough. She had planned for enough because her father had written in the entry from January 1885 that the most dangerous thing in a Montana winter was underestimating it. He had written, "The winter does not care about your calculations. It only cares about the result. Plan for the worst you can imagine, and then add 30%. If you are wrong on the high side, you will be warm and have extra wood. If you are wrong on the low side, you will be dead." The mathematics of survival have no sympathy for optimism. She stacked additional kindling near the hearth, where she could reach it without moving far. She filled both kettles from the bucket and set them near the hearth. She laid a fire ready to light, but did not light it yet. She lay down on her bedroll and pulled the blanket up and opened her father's journal to the December 1884 entry, the one where it all began, the one about going down instead of up, the one about the man who positions himself instead of fighting. And she read it one more time. Outside, the sky finished making up its mind. The first gust hit the plateau like a fist, and then the real wind came behind it, and the snow came with the wind, and the temperature began to fall with a speed that was not natural in the everyday sense of the word, but was entirely natural in the deeper sense, the sense in which nature occasionally decides to remind everything on the surface of the earth what the surface of the earth actually is. Clara lay still and listened to the sound of the storm, finding her roof and finding nothing to get a grip on. The sod and the earth and the 6 feet of Montana soil above her absorbing the wind, the way deep water absorbs a stone thrown into it accepting it, incorporating it, giving nothing back. She was warm, 3/4 of a mile away, in the 2-story frame house with its glass windows and its Chicago iron stove and its good plank floors. Judge Raymond Holt fed another log into the fire and watched the temperature gauge above the mantelpiece drop 2 degrees in the time it took him to close the stove door. He had not seen the territorial response to his notice of intent. He had not heard back from the county commissioners. He had not known about the winter removal protection provision that Clara had invoked in her letter, because the response from Billings had gone directly to Clara and not to him, and the clerk in Billings had added a note at the bottom of his reply, in small, careful handwriting, that the statute was clear and the county commissioners had acknowledged receipt. Holt did not know this. He sat in his good chair with his newspaper and his stove, and the comfortable certainty that the law was moving in his direction, which it was, just not in the direction he believed. Half a mile in the other direction, Walt Greer was in his new root cellar with a lamp and his builder's manual open on his knees, reading the section on earth shelters with the particular intensity of a man who is no longer reading for information, but for the thing he missed the first time through, which is always worse than not having read it at all. His son Daniel sat at the entrance, just inside the door, and did not say anything, because there was nothing useful to say. The wood plank floor was cold under his boots. He could feel it. He pressed his palm flat against it, the way Clara had pressed her palm along her door frame, checking for air movement, and held it there, and felt the cold that was coming up through the boards, cold that was not coming from outside, but from the ground itself, ground that at this depth should have been warm, but was not, because there was a floor of white pine between the ground and the air, and the pine was doing exactly what pine does, which is insulate, which in this case meant insulate in exactly the wrong direction. And in the small, warm dark of the dugout near Willow Creek, Clara Bowen lay on her river stone floor and listened to the storm and was not afraid, because she was where her father had told her to be, which was down, which was in, which was exactly where the cold could not go. She closed her eyes. The stones were warm beneath her. The earth was warm around her. The wind above was everything, and the earth below was enough. She slept, and the storm came down off the Beartooth Range with everything it had. The storm lasted 61 hours. People who lived through the blizzard of December 1888 on the Montana High Plateau described it in the years afterward with the particular economy of language that people use for things they cannot fully articulate as the bad one, or the one that came at Christmas, or simply as the storm, said in a tone that required no further explanation to anyone who had also been there. The official record at the Territorial Weather Office in Helena noted sustained winds of 54 miles per hour, a temperature low of 38 degrees below zero at the Billings station, and snowfall accumulation of 31 inches over the 61-hour period. These were numbers. They did not convey what it was like to stand in it for 30 seconds, which was approximately how long a man could manage before the exposed skin of his face began to fail. Inside the dugout, Clara slept through the first 4 hours of it. She woke to a sound she could not immediately identify, a low, continuous vibration in the sod above her head that was not quite sound and not quite pressure, but some combination of both. The storm transmitting itself through 6 feet of Montana earth the way a distant train transmits itself through the rail before you can hear it with your ears. She lay still for a moment, orienting herself to the dark. The candle had burned out. The fire had burned down to coals that glowed the color of old copper in the blackness. The air in the dugout was warm, genuinely warm, not the marginal warmth of a space being fought for against the cold, but the settled warmth of a space the cold had simply not reached. The difference between a fire being won and a fire having never started. She lit a candle. She checked the temperature with the strip of paper she had marked with gradations, a crude instrument she had fashioned from a method described in one of her 3 books, a thin strip soaked in salt solution and dried, which curled more or less tightly depending on moisture content in the air, a reasonable proxy for temperature once she had calibrated it against known reference points. It read 64 degrees. She stoked the coals with 3 pieces of cottonwood and listened to the storm above her and felt, for the first time since September, entirely unconcerned. This did not last. The knock came at 3 in the morning. She knew it was a knock because she heard it clearly enough through the door, which was a good sign about the door's construction and a concerning sign about the severity of whatever was outside it, because a person knocks at 3 in the morning during a 61-hour blizzard only when the alternative is worse than knocking. She was on her feet and at the door in the time it takes to make a decision, which in Clara's case was not long. She opened the door. Daniel Greer was standing in the opening, with snow caked so deeply into his coat and his hair and his eyebrows that he looked less like a person and more like the idea of a person made of winter. Behind him, the storm was a wall of moving white that had no depth or distance, just motion. He was holding his right arm against his chest in a way that was not natural. She stepped back and let him in and closed the door. He stood in the center of the dugout and dripped snow onto the riverstone floor and breathed in shallow, rapid increments, the breathing of someone whose body is trying to recover from something faster than it can manage. His lips were the color of creek ice. She pushed him toward the hearthstones, and he sat without resistance, which told her more about his condition than anything he could have said. She put water on. She took her blanket and put it over his shoulders. She did not ask what had happened yet, because the sequence mattered. Warmth first, then information, and she had learned this from her father, who had pulled 2 men out of collapsed shafts and understood that the order of interventions was not sentiment, but physics. When the color had come back into his lips and he had stopped shaking enough to hold a cup, she handed him the hot water, and he drank it in the way that a person drinks who has crossed some internal threshold they did not know existed until they crossed it. Then he told her. Walt Greer's root cellar had collapsed. Not gradually, not slowly, not in the way that structures fail when they have been weakening for a long time. It had gone in the first 6 hours of the storm, when the snow load on the single layer of sod reached a weight that the cottonwood rafters, undersized for their span and mortared into sandy clay that had by then dried and cracked, could not carry. The cracking had started at the lower section of the front wall, exactly where the clay was thinnest, exactly where the mortar composition had made it brittle rather than flexible, and the crack had propagated upward into the rafter-bearing surface in a matter of minutes, transferring the load to a wall that was already failing, and the whole thing had come down in one decisive movement rather than a slow sag. The way structures fail when they have been built to look correct from the outside, but have no resilience in the places where the real forces live. Walt had been inside at the time, checking his provisions, making an inventory of what he had and how long it would last. The collapse had driven the roof onto his left leg at the upper thigh, a crushing injury, not a cut or a bruise, but the kind of damage that requires something to be lifted off a person rather than bandaged. Daniel had been in the house when he heard it, had run out into the storm with a lantern that the wind killed in the first 30 seconds, had found his way to the cellar by memory and by feel, had dug at the debris with his hands. In 38 below zero wind, until his right arm stopped working properly and had gotten enough of the weight off his father to drag him clear. Walt Greer was alive. He was in the house. He was in pain that Daniel described with a precision and a flatness that Clara recognized as the description of a person who has decided not to feel what they are feeling until they can afford to. She said quietly, "Where in the leg?" He said the upper left thigh. No bone showing, no bleeding. He could see through the clothing, but the leg was misshapen in a way that Walt had not allowed him to look at for long. She said she needed to go. He said the storm was too severe. She looked at him. She said she knew that. She picked up her coat. He said he would take her back. She said he would take her back and then go inside and not come back out until morning. He started to argue, and she said, in the voice her father had used when he meant something and intended it to land, that his right arm was compromised, and he had already made one trip through the storm, and she needed him functional when she got there, not heroic on the way there. He was quiet. She took that as agreement. They went out into the storm together. What happened in the next 3/4 of a mile belonged to a category of experience that does not translate well into description. The kind of thing that a man remembers not as a sequence of events, but as a set of physical sensations that replay without narrative. The weight of the wind at a particular angle. The way the cold went through the layers of clothing with a patience that felt almost deliberate. The complete absence of visibility beyond the span of an arm. The necessity of moving forward without being able to see forward, which is one of the most fundamental tests of character there is. Clara moved. Daniel moved behind her with his good hand gripping the back of her coat. She counted paces. She had walked this route enough times to know it in her body, the way a person knows a piece of music they have played until the fingers remember it without the mind. They reached the Greer house in 31 minutes. It should have taken 8. Walt Greer was on the floor of the main room, his back against the base of the iron stove, which he had managed to build up enough to provide some warmth. The room was cold, not dangerously cold, but cold in the way that large wood frame spaces are cold in severe weather, the heat climbing to the ceiling and the cold pooling at floor level. The iron stove working hard and losing the argument against the particular combination of thin walls and a high ceiling and the 61 hours of storm pressure against every seam in the structure. His face was grey and sheened with sweat that should not have been there in that temperature, which told Clara that the body was working hard on something internal. She knelt beside him and looked at the leg without touching it first. She had no medical training. She had 3 books, none of which was a medical text, and a father who had spent 11 years in mines where injuries happened in conditions without doctors. And the difference between a man who lived and a man who died was frequently the person next to him and what that person decided to do. Henry Bowen had written, in an entry from 1883, about pulling a man's dislocated shoulder back into place because there was no one else, and the man could not do it himself. He had written, "I did not know if I was doing it right. I knew I had to do something. Most of the time, that is enough." She said to Walt, in a measured voice, that she was going to look at the leg, and she needed him to tell her where the pain was worst. He looked at her. He was 45 years old, and had built things with his hands for 20 years, and was lying on his own floor in his own house because a 16-year-old girl's construction principles had been correct and his had been wrong. And whatever that cost him internally was not visible on his face, because he was the kind of man who keeps that particular accounting private. He said the pain was at the upper thigh, and something felt wrong in the hip joint as well. She worked through the next 2 hours carefully and without drama. The thigh was badly bruised and possibly cracked, but the bone had not displaced, which was the outcome that mattered most. The hip was deeply strained, not dislocated, but inflamed and painful in a way that would require rest and would make walking impossible for at minimum 2 weeks. She immobilized the leg with strips of cloth, and 2 lengths of cottonwood she split from the firewood stack, fashioning a crude splint that would hold the alignment through the night. She built the stove up to a temperature that pushed the room toward warmth without burning through the wood too fast. She got water into him. She got Daniel to eat something. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at the two of them and understood that she could not leave because the storm was still at full force outside and would be for some time, and because Walt could not manage the stove alone, and Daniel's right arm was swollen in a way that suggested a sprain serious enough to compromise his grip. She was going to be here for a while. She settled in next to the stove and put more wood on and looked at the room around her, the plank floors and the wood frame walls with their thin chinking, and the ceiling that was doing its best to hold the heat and failing, the warmth rising and disappearing the way warmth always does in a space that does not understand heat, that treats it as a visitor rather than a resident. The room was not dangerous, but it was cold in the way that made her understand, with a completeness she had not had before, what her father had meant when he wrote about the difference between fighting the cold and understanding it. This room was fighting. Her dugout was not fighting. Her dugout had simply gone somewhere the cold did not follow. Walt Greer said, from the floor, that he owed her an apology. She said he did not need to do that right now. He said he had been going to say it before this. He had been working up to it since the afternoon she had told him about the floor. He said he had not said it then because he was not ready. He was ready now. She looked at him. He was lying on his floor with an improvised splint on his leg and a grey face and the particular expression of a man who has been brought by circumstances to a place he would not have chosen but intends to handle with whatever dignity the situation allows. He said he had sent Daniel to observe her structure. He said he had done it without asking her. He said he had taken what Daniel reported and used it to build something without crediting the source. And that was theft of a particular kind, the kind that men of his generation sometimes do not recognize as theft because it does not involve money, but is theft nonetheless. She said she knew. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he knew she knew. He said that was the part that had stayed with him. Not that she had caught him, but that she had said nothing about it and done nothing retaliatory and had still, tonight, come through a blizzard to help him. He said he did not know what to do with that. She said there was nothing to do with it. She said she came because he was hurt, and because Daniel had come to get her, and because that was what people did. He said that was what some people did. She did not answer that. She put more wood on the stove. In the morning, the storm was still going. The second day of it was different from the first. Less violent in terms of gusting, but colder in an absolute way, the temperature outside dropping into territory that no amount of wind could make feel worse, because at a certain point, the numbers stop carrying emotional weight and start carrying only physical consequence. Clara kept the stove fed and kept the water hot and kept Walt comfortable and sat by the stove and read, from memory, her father's journal entries to herself in a low voice, not performing them, but working through them the way she worked through problems, methodically, looking for the pieces she had not yet fully absorbed. On the afternoon of the second day, Daniel came back from where he had been sleeping near the stove and sat down beside her and said, after a long silence, that he had something to show her. He said he had been carrying it since November and had not known when the right time was to bring it out, had not been certain it was his to bring out at all, but that the last 18 hours had settled the question for him. She looked at him and waited. He said that after their conversation in November, the one where she had told him about the flaw, he had gone home and looked through his father's papers, looking for anything about earth shelters, trying to understand the principles for himself. He had not told his father he was looking. He had done it in the evenings when Walt was in the yard, going through the desk drawer by drawer, and what he found had stopped him cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature outside. He had found, in a locked box in his father's desk that he had opened with a letter knife, a folder of documents. Most of them were contracts and land records. But one of them was different. It was a technical document, 8 pages, handwritten in a careful, deliberate hand that was not his father's hand. It described a heating system based on Earth thermal mass principles. It included calculations for optimal excavation depth, floor material specification, wall packing ratios, and flue sizing. It was complete and precise and, as far as Daniel could tell from what he now understood of the subject, entirely correct, more than correct. It was the document that, if anyone had read it and acted on it, would have made the winter of 1888 something other than what it had become for most of the families on the plateau. At the top of the first page, in that careful handwriting, was a name, Henry Bowen, and a date, March 1886. Clara was very still. He said he had sat with it in his hands for a long time, that November evening, knowing it was hers, and not knowing how to give it back, knowing that the giving of it would change something between his family and hers in a way that could not be unchanged, knowing also that not giving it would be the same kind of theft as the one his father had committed when he used her principles without asking. He had put it in his coat pocket the following morning and carried it every day since, waiting for the moment when giving it was more honest than holding it. He reached into his coat and set the folded papers on the floor between them. Daniel said his father had received this document from Judge Holt. He said there was a letter from Holt in the same folder, dated April 1886, saying that he had come across the document in the county filing office and thought Greer might find it professionally interesting. The letter from Holt was casual in tone, the tone of one businessman sharing a curiosity with another. And then, at the end of the letter, in language that was also casual, Holt had written that, of course, the wide adoption of such a system would significantly reduce demand for milled lumber in the region, which was a matter of some commercial sensitivity given their shared interests, and that he trusted Greer to handle the document with appropriate discretion. Clara looked at the fire. Appropriate discretion. 2 words that sat in her chest like stones from the wrong kind of river, the kind that holds cold instead of warmth. The distance between those 2 words and her father's entry in the journal, the one where he wrote about people dying who did not have to die, was the distance between a comfortable chair in a warm office and a collapsed mine shaft in Silverbow County in March of 1887. Her father had filed his document in 1886. Holt had found it, read it, understood its implications, and redirected it into a locked box in a businessman's desk with a letter using the language of professional courtesy to accomplish what would otherwise have required something more difficult to explain. Henry Bowen had written up his system again and sent it to the territorial office in Helena. The journal said so. Clara did not know what had happened to that second submission. She suspected that the territorial office and the county office had more in common than their letterheads. She suspected this the way you suspect the shape of something you can see the outline of without yet seeing the thing itself. She picked up the document and looked at the first page, at the handwriting that was her father's, large and deliberate and without flourish, spelling out at the top, in that careful hand the title he had given the document, which was On the Practical Application of Geothermal Principles to Residential Construction on the Montana High Plateau, with notes on fuel efficiency and cold weather survivability. She held the papers for a long time. Then she folded them and put them inside her coat, against her chest, in the same place she kept the journal. She put her hand flat against the floor of the Greer house, against the wood planks, and felt the cold coming up through them. And she thought about the river stones in her own floor and what they were doing at this moment, absorbing and radiating and absorbing. The slow, patient cycle of thermal exchange that did not require effort or drama or anyone's approval to continue functioning. She thought about her father writing that document in a company boarding house somewhere in Butte, working out the mathematics in the lamplight, thinking about people dying who did not have to die, and then filing it and never hearing back, and writing it again and sending it somewhere else and never hearing back again, and going to work every morning in a mine that he knew was weakening, telling the foreman twice that the shaft was not safe, and being ignored twice, and going in anyway on the morning of the third day because there was no other work, and the winter was still happening, and a man with a daughter to feed makes certain calculations that a man without obligations does not have to make. She understood, sitting on the plank floor of Walt Greer's house with the storm outside completing its second day, that her father had not left her the journal as a manual. He had left it as a testimony. He had been trying, in the only way available to him, to make sure that what he understood did not disappear when he did. And it had very nearly disappeared anyway, rerouted into a locked box by two men with commercial interests and enough social position to accomplish that rerouting with nothing more than a polite letter and a word about discretion. He said he was sorry. He said it quietly, without looking at her, in the voice of a young man who means something and knows that meaning it is not the same as fixing it. She said she knew. She said it was not his to be sorry for. He said he knew that too. He said it anyway. The storm ended on the morning of December 24th. It ended the way serious things end, not with drama, but with a kind of exhausted release, the wind dropping first, and then the snow thinning to scattered flakes, and then a stillness that was absolute and total, and so complete after 61 hours of the opposite that it felt almost loud. Clara went to the door of the Greer house and opened it, and stood in the frame and looked out at what the plateau had become. A white landscape of such complete uniformity that the familiar landmarks, the tree line, the creek cut, the outlines of structures had been reorganized by the drifts into something that required relearning. The cold was still severe, well below zero, the kind of cold that follows a major storm when the sky clears and the heat escapes upward without cloud cover to hold it. But it was still. The stillness after was its own thing. She walked back to her dugout. It took longer than it should have because the drifts were thigh-deep in places and the path was gone beneath them. She moved by the same method she had used 2 nights before, by the knowledge in her body of where things were, counting and adjusting, reading the slight variations in surface texture that indicated depression or elevation beneath the snow. She had learned this from the journal too, from her father's entry in December 1884. When the snow covers everything, you navigate by what you know of the ground underneath it. The surface lies, the ground beneath does not. She came to the mound of her dugout and almost missed it, because the drift against the south face had built it up to something that blended with the general topography of the whitened plateau. But the kerosene tin chimney pipe was still there, protruding from the sod at the same angle she had set it, and she found the door frame by feel and cleared the drift and went inside. The temperature was 61 degrees. She had been gone 18 hours. There had been no fire. The temperature outside had reached 38 below. And the interior of the dugout, the 10 by 16-foot space she had carved from the Montana earth with a sharpened branch, and her bare hands and the words of a man who had understood something about the ground that most people never thought to ask, was 61 degrees. She sat down on the river-stone floor and put both hands flat against it and felt the warmth coming up through the stones, steady and unhurried, and entirely indifferent to what the last 61 hours had been like above it. The earth had held. It had done exactly what her father said it would do. It had held the memory of summer through the worst storm in a generation, and given it back, without being asked, and without requiring anything in return, except that someone had been paying attention when a miner in a boarding house in Butte had written down what he knew and trusted it would reach the right hands. 3 days after the storm, Judge Raymond Holt rode out to Willow Creek. He came alone, which was unusual for him. He was a man who traveled with the weight of his office, with papers and assistants and the general apparatus of authority. He came this time with none of that. He came on his grey horse in the thin, clear cold of a December morning, and he tied the horse to the cottonwood near the creek and walked to the door of the dugout and stood there. Clara opened the door before he knocked. She had heard the horse. He stood in the pale winter light and looked at her and said nothing for a moment. His face had the quality it always had, that settled stillness, but there was something different in it today. Some displacement in the architecture of it, subtle enough that a person who had not been studying him since September might have missed it. Clara did not miss it. She had been watching this man's face since the land office counter in September, and she knew every register of it. He said he had heard about Walt Greer. She said yes. He said he had heard that she had gone through the storm to help him. She said Daniel had come to get her. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had also received a communication from the county commissioners in Billings regarding her winter removal protection claim, and that the commissioners had determined the protection provision applied and that no removal action could proceed before April 1st. She said she was aware of that. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Between them was the September morning and the land office counter and the notice of intent and the letter written in language designed to accomplish with procedure what could not be accomplished with argument, and also her father's document in a locked box with its 2 years of silence, and the polite letter about commercial sensitivity, and 61 hours of blizzard, and a man's leg on a wood plank floor, and 8 pages of careful handwriting now folded inside her coat next to the journal of the man who had written them. She did not say anything about the document yet. She waited to see what he had come to say. He reached into his coat. He produced an envelope, county office size, official weight paper. He held it out. She took it. She opened it. Inside was a homestead claim form for parcel 47 of the Harlan County Land Register, signed by the land office clerk, countersigned by the county commissioner's representative, and at the bottom, in a different ink than the rest, annotated in a neat, precise hand, approved, with acknowledgement of demonstrated continuous improvement and good faith establishment. R. Holt, County Judge. She read it twice. He said, in the same measured voice he used for everything, that he had also instructed his office to locate the original technical filing made by one Henry Bowen to the county in March of 1886, and to enter it into the official county record under the name of its author, with a notation that the filing had been misdirected and was being restored to the public register. He said that the territorial office in Helena had been contacted as well regarding a second submission believed to have been filed in early 1887, and that they were reviewing their records. She looked at him steadily. She reached into her coat and produced the folded 8 pages and held them where he could see them without offering them to him. He looked at the document. He looked at her. He did not ask how she had come to have it, which told her that he had already spoken to someone who had told him, and that he had come today knowing she knew what he had done, and knowing she would know he knew. He said that his interest in the lumber mill was a matter of public record, and that he was in the process of divesting that interest, which was a financial decision he had been considering for some time, and which recent events had clarified for him. She said quietly that her father had filed his document in 1886. He did not look away. He said yes. She said her father had died in 1887. He said yes. She said that was all she was going to say about it. He nodded once. He was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she understood he was not going to add anything, that he had come with what he had and would not perform a contrition he could not fully mean, because he was not that kind of man, and she was not the kind of person who needed that performance. What she needed was what she was holding in her hand, the claim form with his signature on it, and what the county record would show going forward, and what her father's name would appear on in the Territorial Settlement Guide when it was next printed. He touched the brim of his hat, the same small, formal gesture he had used in September when he rode past her excavation on his grey horse, a man surveying what he assumed would be a brief and unsuccessful experiment. Then he turned and walked back to his horse. She watched him go until the grey horse and the upright figure in the good wool suit had moved far enough down the creek path to become part of the general whiteness of the plateau. Then she went back inside and sat on her floor and held the claim form in both hands and read it one more time. The words that made the ground beneath her feet legally hers, the words that carried her father's name in the restoration order that Holt had attached. She folded the claim form carefully and placed it with the journal and the 8 pages of her father's document, all of it together in the inside pocket of his coat, which she still wore, which still carried somewhere in the weight and the cut of it the particular presence of the man who had worn it first. Walt Greer healed slowly, which is the way that serious injuries in men past middle age tend to heal, not in a straight line, but in the way the land recovers after a hard winter, incrementally, with setbacks moving in a direction that is not always obvious until you look at where it started. He was on a crutch by February. He was walking without it, badly, by March. He came to find Clara on a morning in early April, when the creek ice was beginning to break up, and the first pale suggestions of green were showing in the south-facing slopes. He said he wanted to rebuild the root cellar properly. He said he had thought about whether to ask her, and had decided that not asking was the more foolish option of the 2 available ones. He asked if she would help him understand what he had gotten wrong, all of it, not just the flaw. She said she would. They spent 3 afternoons on it. She did not lecture, she showed. She demonstrated depth selection by having him press his palm into the soil at various points, feeling for the temperature change at the boundary between the disturbed topsoil and the undisturbed subsoil below. She showed him how to assess stone for thermal density, the weight and surface texture that distinguished a good floor stone from one that would absorb poorly. She showed him the mortar mixture, the ratio of clay to grass fiber that prevented cracking under freeze and thaw cycles, pressing a handful of it into a gap in the existing wall and having him do the same and feel the difference in consistency. She showed him the rafter sizing for the span, the calculation her father had written out in the journal, the relationship between roof width and beam diameter that determined whether the structure would carry snow load or surrender to it. He asked good questions. He asked them the way a craftsman asks questions, looking for the mechanical relationship beneath the surface instruction, trying to understand not just what to do, but why it worked. She answered the same way, without condescension, because the thing she was teaching was not hers in the way that would make its transmission a victory. It was her father's, and her father had wanted it shared. She was only doing what he had asked. Reverend Amos Clay came in May. He came to the dugout on a warm spring afternoon when the plateau was beginning to show the first real color of the season, the brown going tawny and the tawny going green at the edges, the cottonwoods along the creek putting out their early leaves in a pale and tentative green that was not yet sure of itself. He knocked, and Clara let him in, and he stood in the interior and looked around with the expression of a man seeing something he has been thinking about for a long time, finally in front of him in its actual dimensions. He said he had been wrong about what he had said in September. He said he had told her that there was something spiritually significant about building upward, reaching toward the sky, aspiring to height. He said he still believed that was true in a general sense, but he said he had been using a general truth to make a specific argument that was not true, which was that going down was giving up. She waited. He said he had been thinking about the 61 hours of the blizzard, about where 14 people in this county had been safe and where they had not been safe, and about what it meant that the safe place was underground and the unsafe places were the ones reaching toward the sky. He said he was not ready to say that meant what it might mean theologically, but he said he was ready to admit that he had used his authority carelessly, that he had offered his opinion as if it were instruction, and his instruction as if it were doctrine, and that a 16-year-old girl, with her father's journal and a sharpened stick, had demonstrated better practical wisdom in one Montana autumn than he had managed in 6 years of sermons. She said she appreciated him saying that. He said it was not easy to say. She said she knew. He asked if he could see the journal. She thought about it for a moment. Then she took it out of her coat and handed it to him. He held it carefully, the way a minister handles a text he has not read but recognizes as significant, and he opened it to the middle and read for a few minutes in silence. She watched him read. She watched the moment when something in the text landed for him, because his jaw shifted slightly and he was still for longer than the reading of a single sentence would require. He closed the journal and handed it back. He said it should be published. He said the man who wrote this was a better theologian than most of the published ones he had studied. She said she was working on getting it into wider circulation. She was. She had been writing letters since January, to newspapers in Billings and Helena and Miles City, to the Territorial Agricultural Office, to the office of the governor, enclosing copies she had made of her father's technical document, and brief accounts of the winter of 1888, and what the dugout had and had not done through 61 hours of the worst storm in a generation. Most of the letters had not yet received responses. Two had. One was from a reporter at the Helena Independent Record who wanted to come to Denton Flats in the spring and interview her and inspect the structure. The other was from the Territorial Agricultural Office in Helena, acknowledging receipt of the Henry Bowen filing and indicating that it had been entered into the public record under the correct date of original authorship, and that the Territorial Office was considering including its principles in the upcoming edition of the Settlement Guide for New Homesteaders on the Montana High Plateau. Her father had filed his document in 1886. The Territorial Office was going to include it in their Settlement Guide, probably in 1890, 4 years later, 2 years after his death. It was not the timeline he had hoped for, but the document would be in the guide. His name would be on it. The principals would be there for every new family coming onto the plateau, every family trying to figure out how to survive the first winter with whatever they had brought with them. Every family that would otherwise spend that winter fighting the cold instead of understanding it. That was what he had wanted. She was doing the last part of the work he had started. In June, Daniel Greer came by the dugout with a length of cottonwood lumber under his good arm, which had healed well enough by then for the kind of careful finish work that suited him. He asked if he could put up a small shelf along the east wall, inside, because he had noticed she was keeping her books on the floor and the moisture from the earth could damage them over time. She said yes. He worked for 2 hours fitting the shelf, cutting notches for the brackets, testing the level, adjusting until the surface was true. He did it quietly and competently, the way he did most things. When it was done, he ran his hand along the top surface to check for roughness and then stepped back and looked at it with the expression of a craftsman who has done the work correctly and knows it without needing to be told. She put the 3 books on it. She put the journal beside them. She put her father's technical document, folded in its envelope, on the end, closest to the hearth, where it would stay dry. She looked at the shelf, and at the books, and at the journal, and at the document, lined up in the amber light of the dugout on a shelf built by the son of a man whose mistakes had nearly buried a dead man's knowledge, in a room built by the daughter of the man who had written that knowledge down and trusted it to outlast him. She thought about this particular way things connect across time, the way a decision made in a boarding house in Butte in 1884 can show up as warmth in a dugout in 1888, the way the words of a dead man can keep a living woman from freezing, the way knowledge moves through people and time, the same way heat moves through stone, slowly, without drama, from where it is to where it needs to be, losing nothing in the transfer except the time it takes. Daniel said from the door that his father wanted to pay her for the teaching she had done in April. He said Walt had asked him to say it plainly, because Walt knew he was not good at the kind of conversation that involved acknowledging debt, but that he was good at settling it. She said that was not necessary. He said his father knew that. He said that was exactly why he wanted to. She thought about Walt Greer asking for a statute number instead of sympathy. She thought about the right way to receive something from a man who has no other language for respect than to treat what you know as worth paying for. She said that she would accept it. He nodded and left. She listened to his footsteps on the thawed ground, getting fainter along the creek path, the particular sound of a young man walking away from somewhere with something different in him than he had when he arrived, which is the best thing a place can do for a person who visits it. She sat down on the Riverstone floor, her floor on her claim, with her father's name restored to the county record and his work on its way into the hands of people who would actually use it, and the plateau outside beginning to open itself to another spring, the grass coming back, and the creek running clear, and the cottonwoods along the bank in the full green of early summer. She put her hand flat on the stones. They were warm. They were always warm. They would still be warm in December, when the next winter came off the Beartooth Range with everything it had, and the one after that, and the one after that. The earth did not forget. It held what it was given. It gave it back at the pace that suited it, which was slower than a man's impatience and steadier than any iron stove. And it asked for nothing except that someone had been paying attention. Her father had been paying attention. He had paid attention long enough to write it down. He had trusted it to the ground, and the ground had trusted it to her. She was paying attention now. The morning light came through the crack of the door and moved across the Riverstone floor in a narrow line, touching each stone in sequence, finding the warmth already there, adding to it in the small way that light adds to things that are already lit, not changing them, not saving them, just confirming what was already true. Clara Bowen was 16 years old, and she owned 160 acres of Montana high plateau and a dugout that the cold could not reach. And her father's words in a cracked leather journal and the knowledge settled now into her bones the way heat settles into stone, that the most important things are almost always found by going deeper rather than higher, by staying still rather than fleeing, by understanding the ground beneath your feet rather than fighting the sky above your head. She picked up the journal and opened it to the first entry. She had read it enough times that she knew it by heart. She read it anyway, because some things are worth reading again and again, not because you have forgotten them, but because you have not yet finished becoming them. Her father had written at the beginning, "The ground under your feet knows things you don't. It has been here longer. Listen to it." She had listened. She was still listening. Outside, the plateau was green and wide and entirely itself, the mountains in the north still carrying snow on their upper shoulders, the creek running with the last of the melt, the sky a clean and specific blue that belonged to early June in Montana and nowhere else on Earth. Somewhere in that landscape, Walt Greer was walking slowly on his healed leg toward a rebuilt root cellar with a proper stone floor and 3 layers of sod on the roof and mortar mixed the way she had shown him, pressing it between his fingers until he felt the right consistency rather than measuring it by the spoonful, learning the knowledge through his hands instead of his head. Somewhere in it, Raymond Holt was riding his gray horse through land that was measurably smaller than it had been in September, the lumber mill interest transferred to a ledger entry in a Billings bank, his name attached now to a restoration order in the county record, rather than to a suppression. Somewhere in it, Amos Clay was composing a sermon that was taking him longer than usual because he was trying to say something true rather than something correct, which are not always the same thing. And he was only recently beginning to understand the difference, and the understanding was making him slower and more careful. And in his better moments, he could recognize that slower and more careful was a reasonable trade for true. And in the dugout near Willow Creek, Clara Bowen sat on her father's floor and read her father's words and let the warmth of the earth come up through the stones the way it always did, slow and certain, from deep in the ground where the cold had never reached and never would. The earth holds its warmth the same way a good man holds his principles, quietly, without drama, through whatever the surface sends down. He had written that. She had built it. It had held. That was enough. That was everything.